And so what I'd like to do is kind of continue through and get this going. So here's a few myths about scholarships in the US. And I hate to kind of burst the bubble on this, but some of these are things that people really believe, but most of them are kind of not true. So most believe that most international students are getting large scholarships to study in the US, and simply, unfortunately, not true. The majority of financial support that international students have is coming from a family member or a sponsor from their home country. So many students are getting a scholarship, but not necessarily a large scholarship. Another one, educational loans are available in the US. Again, unfortunately, they're not typically available. Only if you're a US citizen, or if you're international and you have a US citizen who is willing to sign, like be a co-signer on a loan, but they can be really high interest rate loans when you do that. So generally speaking, again, these are not available to international students. Here's one that's partially true, and that's I can work in the US to help pay my expenses. So it is partially true. On an F1 student visa, you're allowed to work up to 20 hours a week, but that is on campus only. You can't just go work at the local McDonald's. You have to work on campus. But just keep in mind that 20 hours a week, you're not going to make enough money really to pay your bills, your college bills. You're probably going to just make enough for your general spending money. And that's what most international students do. They're working just to have that extra, money in their pocket to buy a pair of jeans or to buy your personal health supplies, your shampoo, your soap, things like that. You would be permitted to work full-time on campus in the summer. And that's when a lot of students, if they do decide to stay in the US, that's when a lot of them do save a bit of money, is when they're working in the summer. But again, that's on campus only. So the last myth that I wanted to talk about is that full tuition or full ride scholarships are very common. Well, obviously from the first one that I said, where large scholarships are not generally available, again, full tuition, full rides are also not very often available. There are occasionally some out there, or a school might just have one to offer or two, but generally speaking, they're pretty rare. So it's okay to ask the question, but please know that it's not very common that you would have that large of an award available. Or if it is, like I said, there's only a couple available, or it's a high competition to be able to get one of them. And I will actually mention at some point something we have at Hope College that is full tuition, but it is highly competitive to get it. And so I'll talk about that later. So what makes up most of the cost of studying in the US? So these 5 items on your left here, this is what makes up generally what we determine when we're determining the total cost. This is what we're looking at. So we're looking at the tuition fees for the whole year. For usually it's 2 semesters, or if the school is on quarters, then it's probably 3 quarters, but it's going to be the majority of the year, right? So that's tuition fees, and then room and board for the same period of time. So room and a meal plan. And then we also include books and supplies. So how much do we estimate that you're going to spend on books and supplies? This can vary greatly. So somebody that's taking a lot of sciences are probably going to have more book costs than somebody who is taking like an English major or a philosophy major. The science books tend to be more expensive, even though they're online now, most of them, they're still more expensive. Most international students in the US, because of an F1 student visa regulation, you have to have health insurance. So most schools will have an agreement with a health insurance company that will provide health insurance for international students. Unfortunately, healthcare is very expensive in the US. So by having health insurance, you're really helping the situation in the sense that if you do have to go to the hospital or even to the doctor, it can be very expensive without health insurance. And then some things that's not, one thing that the last item that's not always included, for example, we don't include it in our cost sheet that you see to the right. That's personal expenses and travel. It is something that you will have, and you'll have, a certain amount of money that you need for it, but we don't include it in our estimated annual expenses because we don't know, number one, travel, where you're coming from. So everybody's travel is going to be different, whether you're going to be going home for the holidays or not, because that adds another cost. And then personal expenses. Some people are very frugal with their money, very careful, while others have kind of bigger expense habits. So it's hard for us to know exactly how much you would use there. So we generally, colleges don't put that in their estimate. But just know these are the costs that we usually look at to come up with our yearly cost of attendance. So one of the things that students need to do when they're applying to a U.S. school is to supply verification of financial support. Okay, so every school will typically have a separate form. It's usually separated from the application itself. It could be part of it, but usually it's separate. It's a verification form that your parent or a sponsor needs to sign, saying that they're going to be providing the financial support for the remainder of the costs after financial aid or after scholarship. So what most of us will do is at the point of application, some schools like Hope, we will make the scholarship award, the partial scholarship, right at the point of the offer of admission. If you get admitted, you're going to get also an offer of a partial scholarship. But some schools will have a separate process with a separate application, et cetera. So you need to ask each college, how am I considered for any scholarship or financial aid that you offer? Most aid that is available out here is merit-based aid. Occasionally a school will have need-based aid, but not all schools have it. For example, here at Hope, we do not offer need-based aid, but some schools do. So you have to ask that question. It's more common with private schools, and Hope is a private school, but it's more common with private schools to have maybe a little bit offered in need-based aid. Public schools typically do not have need-based aid, but again, that's up to the school themselves as to whether they do that or not. So again, as I mentioned, when you're showing financial support as part of the application process, your parents have to show that they can provide the balance of the support after whatever aid has been offered by the college. And then quite often, as I mentioned before, the travel and personal expenses are not included in this budget. So you need to take it into consideration that you're going to have these expenses as well, ultimately. And again, depending on how many times you travel, you'll have that expense every time you go back and forth. So that's why a lot of students don't go home necessarily for every holiday, because it would get very expensive. So this is just a sample of that sheet. It's kind of small, but it just gives you an idea of what one looks like. So again, this is what you're going to have to fill out or something similar for any U.S. college that you apply to. It's going to be a part of the application process, and that's showing that you have financial support. And again, it's the amount of money will be the balance usually after scholarship. Now, there are some schools that ask you right as part of the application process that you have to show the full amount in your bank statement. So for example, if Hope did it, we don't do that. But if Hope did that, that means you would have to show $51,000 in support right at the start, like before any scholarship is offered. So it depends on the school. You have to check with them to see, how much do you have to show in your financial support. We at Hope, we do it where we offer you the scholarship first, and then you show the balance, because that's really what you're going to be paying. So what is considered to be financial aid at a school in the US? So each of these that are listed may or may not be offered by a US university or college. Merit-based aid is usually the most common, and it can be selective. It's definitely based on some criteria of some kind. Basically, usually your marks or your grades on your secondary school transcript, and possibly on national exams if you have those, if you finished them already. Otherwise, it would be based on just how you performed in your secondary school. So the academic criteria usually kind of one of the key points. But they also may consider some other things. So leadership or service or volunteering, that could be a factor potentially in an award. So those two are usually, the academic is the most common. A leadership or service could influence those awards a little bit potentially. A separate award normally that might be available, and it's usually, again, competitive. You have to audition for it or submit a portfolio, and that's a fine arts award. Sometimes, depending on the school, you might have to major in the fine arts to get a fine arts award. Other schools like Hope, we will let you audition for music, theater, dance, or art, or creative writing, and you could get an award up to $3,000. And the only commitment is that you participate in that fine art. So if you're a creative writer and you get a $3,000 scholarship, you would have to take some creative writing courses, but you wouldn't have to major in creative writing. Or if you were a violin player, you could audition for a music scholarship, and maybe your commitment would be to be in the orchestra, but you would not have to major in music. Now, some schools, you do have to major to get the award. So again, something you want to ask. Another type of scholarship is athletic scholarship. Of all of these I've listed so far, this one is the most competitive. And that's because there are literally thousands of students trying to get athletic scholarships for the few spots that every college offers or every university. And not every school can offer athletic scholarships. It depends on it's all about what NCAA division they are in. You don't have to necessarily remember that, but the ones you would see on TV and in the playoffs and the top games on TV, those are Division I, NCAA Division I schools. They're the biggest schools. They do offer scholarship, but again, if you've seen the size of those athletes, these are some pretty big people, pretty talented people. So you have to really be almost like a national level athlete, really, to be considered, or at least a regional, if not a national level athlete, to be considered even for a scholarship in the US. There's just so many students trying to get these awards, and the US is a big place. So the majority of them are coming from the US, obviously. I can tell you that the individual events, or the individual sports such as track and field, swimming, anything like that has a distance or a time attached to it, it's a little easier for a coach to evaluate your talent than a team sport. So soccer, volleyball, basketball, it's a little more difficult for them to evaluate how you would fit into the team here, because it's harder to establish your talent level just on video, right? So individual sports or time sports are a little bit easier for coaches to figure that out. But all colleges typically, even if they don't offer scholarships, for example, Hope College is Division III at NCAA Division III. So we do not offer athletic scholarships, but we have top-notch athletic teams. Our women's basketball team is undefeated for 2 years now. And so, we've got some phenomenal teams. But all schools, regardless of the level, the division, NCAA division they are, whether they offer scholarships, they will have a questionnaire on their athletic pages of their website. So you can go to athletics website, you can look up student questionnaire or student interest form, and you can fill that out. And you can send them your information and your times and your statistics. And so they can take a look at it. And then don't be afraid to follow up with them. Not immediately, give them some time, because they get a lot of these things. But give them a couple weeks and then follow up and make sure that they got it and see if there's any questions. Sometimes you work with a coach who, maybe one of your coaches is very much knows the system and knows how to contact the coaches in the US. And that's okay. Coach to coach contact is fine. But it doesn't mean you're going to get a scholarship. It just means that's another way for your information to be received by our coach is through your coach. Okay. So again, highly competitive, hard to get. But if you're a national level athlete, maybe even regional, certainly worth trying. It's a huge commitment as well if you have one. I mean, it's kind of like we like to say that they own you if you're an athletic scholarship, because you really, they're providing the resources, for the financial resources. So you need to do everything that you need to do to keep that scholarship athletically, but you also have to keep your grades up at the same time. So, it's a double, your time management skills have to be right on par to be able to be a student athlete. So then the other one, need-based grants, that is more rare. There's not that many schools, and they're mostly private, who have need-based grants. I wish there were more. I wish we had them. We just simply don't. But it's worth asking the question if a school offers need-based grants. It just kind of depends on the school and what kind of funding they've got to be able to do that. I mentioned on-campus employment. That is certainly a way to give you some spending money, but again, not a way really to pay your bill. And most schools do not count it as financial aid for international students. US citizens, you could get campus-based employment as a form of financial aid, but that's a federally funded program that international students cannot qualify for. So that's why you won't see that typically in an award, but you are able to work on campus. And the last point I make, that academic and fine arts awards, for example, those can be stacked. So you can usually get both of those. Again, totally up to the school, but it's very common that you can get an academic and a fine arts award. Athletic, it depends on the size of the award, whether they would combine that with something else. So what do we look at if we're looking for academic and leadership scholarships? We're going to be looking at all the academic information that you have from your transcripts, other things that might come into play if you've done any research or internships. These awards, these academic awards, can range from a small amount up to full tuition and full ride, but those two, full tuition, full ride, are pretty rare. Again, possible, but pretty rare. Generally, you can keep your scholarship for 4 years at the undergrad level. And I should say most of the scholarship information I'm talking about is for undergrads. Graduates have a kind of a different type of system. They're usually graduate assistantships, but you usually don't have just regular academic scholarships, normally are not available to graduate students. Again, you can renew them just by keeping a certain GPA. If a school does have anything related to leadership or activity, they're usually looking for something specific. So they might be looking for leadership. They might be looking for involvement in your church. They might be looking for involvement in the Model UN or something. So schools sometimes have specific awards where they're looking for specific activities. And these are usually smaller awards. So it might be just $500 or $1,000. And it is usually renewable. It might require that you are involved in that particular activity on the college campus. Again, this is college to college, everything is different. So some things may be offered at one school that are not offered at another one. Fine arts, I touched upon this just briefly, but here's a little more detail. So the music, theater, and dance are all gonna typically require an audition. And obviously right now they're taped or online auditions. They might do them live. They might want to see you do a live performance. And if that's a live audition, if that's the case, again, live meaning live online as opposed to taped or videoed. That's up to the school. And then the art would be a portfolio, and creative writing usually a portfolio too, if they offer. Not everybody offers all these. Some people offer none of them. Again, you've got to ask. We at Hope happen to offer all of these. And every one of our websites will have web pages for each one of these items to tell you, what you need to send in, how you do it, when you need to do it by. Again, typically pretty highly competitive, and they're even more competitive if you're looking at a specialized school. Like I mentioned there, music conservatories or art schools are going to be very competitive because those are the only students that go there are music. So obviously they're all going to be very good. As I mentioned earlier, at least at Hope, you don't have to major in the fine arts to get a fine arts scholarship. But again, that will be defined by each individual school as to what's required about that. So I mentioned those divisions in NCAA. So here's the first point: Division I and II and NAIA, which are independent schools. They're not part of the NCAA, so you're not going to see them in the big tournaments because they're independent schools. They can offer scholarships. The NCAA Division III, which is usually small private colleges like Hope, they may have excellent teams and they may compete in national championships, but they cannot offer athletic scholarships. Again, highly competitive. It can be, as I mentioned, more challenging to be considered if you're part of a team sport. Not impossible, just more challenging. You want to provide as much good video coverage as possible and as many statistics as possible. Because what they can't see is they don't know, you may look really good on the field, but they don't really know the level of competition. So the team you're competing against, were they very good or not? Sometimes you can tell, sometimes you can't. So you can be a really good athlete in a really bad, a really low quality athletic league. So yes, you're fantastic, but your competition level isn't very high. So so there's a lot of factors there, right? Some teams will allow you to try out. Even if they don't recruit you, they might allow you to try out when you arrive. Again, that's up to the school, up to the individual coach. Even with athletic scholarships, they can be small. It can be just a book stipend. So your books are the only things being paid for, which would be like $1,000 a year, or maybe $2,000, or as large as a full scholarship. But again, very rare because schools only have so many full scholarships to give for athletics. So they're typically going to divide them up and give them to multiple students rather than just give like 3 awards to 3 students. They want to give maybe 6 half awards to 6 students, right? So again, that's up to the coach. Really briefly, what do we offer? Our academic-based scholarships, and this will be similar to maybe other schools, just different amounts and different criteria maybe, but academic-based, we're up to $25,000. I mentioned the initiative earlier, the full tuition one, that's the Hope Forward initiative. So students who apply in the fall have the chance to apply for Hope Forward as well. And it's really a 3.25 or higher, but I can tell you the average student coming to Hope is a 3.8 out of 4. So the higher your GPA is, the better chance you have of really getting different types of opportunities. But 3.25 or higher can apply. And then we're only selecting 20 students, but you would attend Hope College tuition free for 4 years, but you would make the pledge to contribute back to Hope College annually after graduating. Not a specific amount, we're just asking you to contribute back on an annual basis. And all those funds from the students who are doing that will go back into the Hope Forward Fund. And it's the pay it forward concept. You're going to be helping to pay for students to come in the future, just as somebody helped to pay for you to come to Hope. So early admission is recommended because we may actually come out, it says early December when we'll do invitations. It might come out earlier than that. So I recommend early applications. And then we do have the Distinguished Artist Award, which is the Fine Arts Awards as well, up to $3,000 based on an audition. Tips to remember, and this is kind of the end of the presentation, we'll go to Q&A. So start the application process early. Don't wait because you might miss deadlines, and that's the second point. We will rarely make an exception on a deadline, especially for scholarship. Usually it's a deadline and we stick with it. When you're filling out the applications, fill them out completely, answering all the questions. Don't leave things blank because it will leave us to wonder, why did you leave that blank? And what are we missing here? If essays are required, make sure that you're looking at the instructions and you're following them. What are they asking for, especially if it's a scholarship application? I know for our Hope Forward campaign, it's 2 very specific questions that you have to answer. If you don't answer those specific questions, you will be eliminated automatically, okay? Ask the institution about any available scholarships and instructions on how to apply. That's an okay question. And make sure you understand any rules or obligations on your part in relation to keeping that scholarship or renewing that scholarship. And also make sure you understand what is the balance after the scholarship. Because just because you get the scholarship, unless it's a full award, you're still going to have a balance that you have to pay. Certainly look for any opportunities there in the Caribbean that might help you to be able to study in the US. If there's any scholarship grants or loans, certainly encourage you to look into those. And then I mentioned about the athletics earlier, about doing the questionnaire on the website, having your coach contact our coach, putting together highlight videos. So those are all tips related to athletics. We've covered this stuff really, really fast. So I'm gonna make sure that in the Q&A, we're able to go into any more detail, but there's my contact information as well. And so in a second here, I'll go off the share screen so that we're all kind of on screen together, but I at least want to leave that up for a second. And if you do have questions, and if you don't get it down, you can always check with Sheena and she can help you make contact with me as well at a later time.
Thank you, Jim, for that very comprehensive presentation. And I hope that everyone found it informative. Just to recap some of the key points. So there are different variations of scholarships and what is termed financial aid, whether you are an international student or you are a student with dual citizenship for the US, especially at the undergraduate level. And so there are different types based on your academics and some on your own extracurricular ability, such as sports, or whether you're into the performing arts. And some of the possibility for you to stack some of your aid is possible depending on the school. And it really boils down to how you choose your schools. And sometimes persons, I find, choose based on what is popular and not necessarily what may make sense for their individual situation. So you have to really look at it as when you're looking at preparing for college or university, you're looking at studying abroad specifically, you have to really choose your schools based on your situation. There are over about close to 5,000 institutions, colleges, and universities across the US to choose from. That's a whole load of institutions. It's impossible to look at every single one. So therefore, it's good to rely on expertise that are very familiar with the schools and the concept of applying as a F1, or even whether or not you are a US citizen. So I encourage you to get as much informed information, one that's coming from qualified sources as well, and not from a he said, she said in social circles sometimes, which is not always qualified advice. So your guidance counselors, school representatives, experts in college and university prep, there are a number of persons out there. So it's good to see what is available to you. So thank you, Jim, for putting that information to us. Now let's get to answering your questions.